All right, we're going to get underway here. So we'll move into our afternoon session. So this morning we spent a lot of time talking about developing our project team, planning out a project. Now we're going to get more into the nuts and bolts of how we're going to put this restoration on the ground. And so this whole session between now and break at 3 o'clock is going to be about the land preparation and planting. Essentially, what do we need to know before we put seed in the ground? And so our first session this afternoon will be about what shapes grasslands and the grasslands of today, and that will be presented to us by Cody with Audubon Great Plains.
All right. Well, as I was putting this together, it's kind of, it's such kind of a broad topic, and kind of what do you put in, what do you leave out? And I was thinking of a book I'd read a while back. Bill Bryson's Short History of Nearly Everything, and I was like, he would probably very succinctly put things together. And so I kind of went with that for my model. So, what's so important about grasslands? Why do we really care? Why are we here? Growing up here, I think, most of us feel kind of a sense of stewardship about them. Here they're home to some charismatic, species that, we care and love. And they provide ecosystem services, not only here in the Great Plains, but, kind of beyond. Think of the Missouri River and the Mississippi watershed. All the impacts that we have up here happen down there. Migratory bird species. Some people down there in Florida looking at some burrowing owls and finding them kind of cute and funny. We raise them up here. And, the other really interesting thing, too, is that, of all the ecosystems, it's almost an entirely edible landscape. So, it creates a real potential for wildlife and livestock production, and just a really, really neat thing. But, why are we in the grasslands? Why are they here? Well, first you kind of got to start off with is, it's a little flat out here, and there's some, differences between the east side and the west side. During the Pleistocene, 15,000 years ago, some big glaciers were going through the eastern side of the state, basically really shaping the east side of the state, creating a deep layer of glacial till, which resulted in a lot of closed basin wetlands, some good deep quality soils, kind of that typical, nice arable cropland. Over on the West River, avoided the glaciation, thinner soils, a little bit more saline, tend to be a little bit more clay, and a lot more kind of, tributaries that, eventually drain down into the Missouri River. Climate's one of our big primary drivers of the grasslands. We're in kind of that little Goldilocks zone where we get all the four seasons. Cold right now, obviously, really hot and dry in the summertime. And a lot of that was shaped by, we're still in the rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains, so we kind of see that precipitation gradient from the, still pretty dry, 10 inches per year in the west side of the state to almost 25 inches on the east side. And again, we see wide yearly fluctuations in precipitation, and multi-year droughts are not uncommon. Our second big driver in the plains was, for better or worse, we had a lot of fire that came through the area, and really the whole continent was, really affected by fire. You see estimates, in the center part of the state in this area ranging from, 3 to 7, 8 to 12. Usually I say 8 is kind of a general number, but, it came through quite a bit. And, some of the big drivers of those fires, the people that were here prior to us, they used fire for all sorts of reasons. One of the big ones was, attracting bison, one of their main prey species. It also provided increased foraging opportunities. If you'd go light off a patch of buffalo berries, you're going to end up with more berries the next year. But, a lot of these, kind of prairie shrub species were very adapted and put out a lot of berries during those times of year. War, safety, it's kind of some other things. A slide that got cut out. I'm not sure exactly why, but we also had a lot of pioneers coming through the area, and they were, you look at the late 1800s. Actually, that fire return interval actually increased quite a bit. So that's something I really find kind of interesting. Is that for a while there it was even a bigger driver of the grasslands. But, and then probably that third biggest driver was, we had a lot of critters here. Again, that's that entirely edible landscape. The bison, obviously. We had a lot of elk running around on the plains. Huge colonies of prairie dogs that are constantly kind of, clipping grasses short. Obviously, the mule deer, the pronghorn, grasshopper populations. And the way these animals grazed was, it was really variable. These big, large herds that were, had really strong herding ability, so they kind of stuck together, and they would, were able to kind of go wherever they wanted to. At times they could be kind of limited by water availability. Often they would follow these prairie fires and regraze that new vegetation that came up afterwards. Some of them might have hung around prairie dog towns as they, that constant clipping kept the nutrition really kind of lush and high in crude protein. Something we kind of forget about too, it's lost, is, you read about, through the 1700s, 1800s, huge plagues of grasshoppers, and specifically one known as the Rocky Mountain locust came through. Just really, really terrible accounts of just, crop failures, range failures, and kind of an interesting thing is I think they found the last one. I think it was back in 1902. They just kind of abruptly went extinct. So for right or wrong, that's not a problem we have to deal with anymore. And in all that chaos, the climate, the fire, the grazing, phenomenal recipe for building soil. Just that constant regrazing, defecation by animals. Fire, different microbial activity in the soil, growth and dieback of roots, just an incredible system for just building soil. The other thing that, you kind of feel obligated to mention, we had a teaspoon of soil. A little anecdote you feel obligated to say. A teaspoon of soil has the same biodiversity in it as an entire rainforest. I've not counted that, but that's what they tell me. And they say also a teaspoon of soil has as many organisms in it as the entire continent of North America. What's most special about these species? Why do they come to evolve and kind of grow the way they do and be the species they are? You've kind of touched upon them. They're drought resistant. They can handle those long-term droughts and still persist. Tolerant of extreme grazing events, as we mentioned, those giant herds of buffalo, prairie dogs, all that kind of stuff. They're able to persist over those events. Talked about fire. These species, they respond well to these events. They increase their seed viability. The forbs and wildflowers will produce more nectar. The flammable leaves were, kind of used to keep, other competitive species away from them. And, those deep roots and low growth points were just adaptations to live in this prairie environment. Some I think is kind of helpful, as we talk about, planting things back and kind of what differs one species from the other. You've all heard, warm season, cool season grass. It's more a little bit than, some like it hot, some like it cold. There's actually different enzymes, specifically in the warm season grasses that kind of affect the way they fixate carbon, affect the way that you're able to process nitrogen and water. That C3 pathway, kind of the optimum's kind of around 60 degrees. So you think your cool season natives, whatever cool season introduced grasses or trees, they are not as efficient as that typical when season C4 pathway. That just it does a little bit better, or does quite a bit better when conditions are right. And if you kind of keep in mind that that central growth curve there, you can kind of see how it matches up to that continental climate I mentioned earlier. Typically, we get most of our rainfall in that kind of June, July time frame, and what's going on that time of year? We have big, heavy thunderstorms. So they're not necessarily the garden variety showers. That stuff's coming down, fast and furious at times. And thinking back to that previous slide, which carbon pathway, which kind of species might be more adapted to this type of a climate. And so that's kind of a little bit of the background of what was going on in the plains, but obviously there were a lot of changes. We had a little bit of changeover between the indigenous folks that were out here to some of the pioneers and settlers that came into the area. One of the first things that happened was there was a big campaign to hunt buffalo. They hunted them for hides. Cut out the tongues. The bones and skulls were used for phosphate fertilizer. Same thing goes with the elk and a lot of the other species. You got a lot of people out there, a lot of hungry mouths, and they utilized them. The other big one pushing folks was bringing folks out. The Homestead Act of 1962. It was basically thought, you break the earth open and, the water will kind of come out and fall back down as rain. And that worked for a little bit. And basically that fire return interval we talked about, it kind of became a little bit acceptable. When you're trying to grow wheat out on the prairie and you got folks setting fires, just didn't really fit well within the community. So starting in the late 1800s, no more fires allowed intentionally anyway, out on the range. The other big thing we had happen, there's a really bad fire year in 1910, and the federal government stepped in and put a lot of resources towards fire suppression and widespread educational campaigns. And a lot of that climaxed into, most of us have heard of the Dust Bowl. It was really a horrific human and natural resource horror, and really the biggest human-caused disaster in the nation's history. With that, we had a lot of bare ground, a lot of dust in the landscape, and there was some big pushes for revegetation efforts. Typically, the plants used in these, tended to be some, stuff they were harvesting, some introduced species that were easy to harvest, they were reliable, and usually just kind of single 1-2 species mixes. Other big program that came after the Dust Bowl, the Great Plains Shelter Belt Project, planting 220 million trees over 860 miles from North Dakota to Texas over an 8-year period. So we kind of talked about, the dynamics and drivers of the previous grassland systems, but let's talk about what changed. Obviously we mentioned the fire suppression, different grazing regimes, went from bison to cattle, very, long, intense periods between grazing events to, very consistent, regular events on the landscape. Another big one that we've kind of learned about, we've got an increase in CO2 capacity. For whatever you think of climate change, we do have a lot more carbon in the atmosphere. We've also seen similar things with atmospheric and soil nitrogen. Precipitation has been increasing over the last couple of decades, and we've got some longer growing seasons. And what that has kind of amounted to is we've had an interesting dynamics happening with some of our introduced grasses, kind of during that time of the Dust Bowl and afterwards. The main ones that tend to affect our grasslands right now, smooth brome, Kentucky bluegrass, reed canaries, another one in the meadows. They are increasing rapidly, and it's really kind of a newer thing. A lot of the research shows, a lot of that's kind of, even though they were planted quite a long time ago, a lot of this stuff is occurring just since the 90s. The big one is, through through those widespread plantings, through the Shelter Belt Project and others, and also that suppression of fire. Some trees that, just kind of were kind of here and there are now kind of everywhere. Noxious weeds, I'm kind of, these previous species, they are changing the landscape. And the noxious weeds, whether they are or not, I've got my own opinions. And just something to keep in mind is that correlation is not always equal causation. So going back to those introduced grasses, they're simplifying our plant communities. We talked a little bit earlier about pheasants. What the effects of brome was and that kind of thing. The reality is those simplified plant communities. There are less bugs out there, less seeds. Less other things for young pheasants, young grouse, young birds, a variety of things. They don't stand up as well to snow. They're decreasing our soils in both, infiltration, erosion, carbon storage. And, we kind of mentioned earlier there with the soil chemistries, a teaspoon to make a rainforest. Maybe we're up to 3 teaspoons or a pint, I don't know. And kind of lastly, I can't be up here at Cedar Shores and not talk about the Green Glacier. We talk about things affecting our grasslands, and this is a big deal. It's happening out in the west, kind of coming out from the buttes and kind of its natural habitat. Over in the east, spreading away from tree belts and some of those other planted lands. And it is steadily ticking along, even though a lot of these plantings were from quite a while ago. We see, here just in recent decades, it's really speeding up. And those, especially those, the juniper cohorts, the eastern red cedar and Rocky Mountain juniper, they're the fastest spreading type of tree in the nation, inside and outside of its native range. And that goes for all junipers, really. It's happening in Arizona. It's happening in the Great Basin. It's happening out in Tennessee. Whatever we're doing right now, these species are thriving. And this is obviously a little bit of an older graph here, but I mean, it just really goes to show you what kind of an impact that's having. I haven't talked a lot about, conversion, because for the most part we don't have a lot of control over that. But this tree issue, that's something we do have a control over. Whether you're a landowner, a technical assistance provider, a land manager, we do have the opportunity to change this curve and kind of get some grasslands back. I'm not a big fan of the Green Glacier term, so I took a little bit of a stab at trying to rebrand a little bit, but it's a work in progress. And again, that grassland ecology, there's a lot to it. A lot of different factors that are hard to put into 15 minutes. But there are a lot of great resources here. We lost a couple of really good ones this summer, but depending on your question and things, don't be afraid to ask questions, network. There's a lot of opportunity out there.